The afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Haneda Airport's international terminal caught the diamond bracelet on Yuki Tanaka's wrist as she gestured dismissively toward the black man in worn jeans struggling to calm his crying daughter near Gate 47. She turned to her assistant Kenji and spoke in rapid Japanese, her voice carrying that particular tone of contempt wealthy people use when they assume their targets can't understand them. Look at that man, typical. Can't even control his own child in public. These people come to Japan and have no sense of decorum or respect for others. Probably doesn't even know how to be a proper father. I bet he's never worked a real day in his life, just living off government assistance and making everyone around him miserable with his inability to parent. Kenji shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, his eyes flicking toward the man who was now kneeling beside his daughter, wiping her tears with gentle hands, whispering something that was making her small moms quiet into hiccups. Yuki continued in Japanese, her manicured hand waving toward the father and daughter, like they were a distasteful display she wished removed from her field of vision. This is exactly why standards are declining everywhere. People like him shouldn't be allowed to travel internationally if they can't maintain basic civilized behavior. That child is disturbing everyone in this terminal because he lacks the discipline to raise her properly. The little girl couldn't have been more than 5 years old, her braids coming loose from their ribbons, her face streaked with tears, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had clearly seen better days. The man stood slowly, his daughter now calm in his arms, and turned to face Yuki with eyes that held something between exhaustion and steel. Then he spoke in Japanese so flawless it could have been mistaken for that of a Tokyo native, each word precise and carrying the weight of controlled anger. My daughter is crying because her mother died 3 weeks ago, and this is our first trip since the funeral. She's 5 years old and grieving. But thank you for your compassionate observation about my parenting and your assumptions about my work ethic and character based entirely on the color of my skin. Your concern is noted. If that opening made your blood run cold, if you can already feel the justice building like a storm that's about to break, then hit that like button right now. Share this with everyone who's ever been judged by strangers who knew nothing about their story, who've been dismissed because of how they looked or where they came from, who needs to be reminded that assumptions are dangerous and people are more than surface judgments. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories about moments when prejudice meets reality, when the underestimated reveal depths no one imagined, when karma arrives so perfectly timed it feels like the universe is paying attention. Now let me take you back to understand exactly who both these people were, because the collision that just happened in that airport terminal was about to become something neither of them could walk away from unchanged. Yuki Tanaka was the CEO of Tanaka Global Industries, a conglomerate worth $8 billion with holdings in technology, real estate, and manufacturing across 17 countries. She'd inherited the company from her father at 32 and had spent the past 8 years proving to the business world that she was more than just a legacy appointment. She'd tripled the company's value through aggressive acquisitions and cost-cutting measures that had eliminated thousands of jobs, but increased shareholder profits. She was ruthless, brilliant, and had built a reputation as someone who didn't apologize for success or for the casualties that success sometimes required. Yuki had grown up in Tokyo's wealthiest district, educated at the best schools, fluent in 4 languages, and had never once in her 40 years experienced real hardship or been told that she didn't belong somewhere. She'd learned to view the world as divided into two categories: people who mattered because they had wealth and power, and people who didn't matter because they lacked both. Her wealth had insulated her from consequences, and her position had surrounded her with people who never challenged her assumptions or called out her casual cruelty because their jobs depended on her goodwill. She was flying back to Tokyo from a business meeting in New York where she just closed a deal to acquire a struggling American tech company, a transaction that would make her richer and cost 300 employees their jobs when she shuttered the American operations and moved production to cheaper facilities in Southeast Asia. The crying child at Gate 47 had been an annoyance, a disruption to the peaceful waiting area Yuki believed she deserved. And insulting the father in Japanese had felt safe because she'd assumed he wouldn't understand, And even if he did, what could he do about it? The man holding his daughter was Dr. James Carter. Though Yuki didn't know his name or his credentials or the fact that he was one of the foremost experts on Japanese economic history in the world. James had gotten his PhD from Waseda University in Tokyo after spending 7 years in Japan researching post-war industrial development. He'd learned Japanese as an undergraduate on a whim, had fallen in love with the language and culture, and had become so fluent that he'd published 3 books in Japanese that were used as textbooks in Japanese universities. He'd met his wife Akiko at Waseda, a fellow doctoral student whose smile had made him believe in the possibility of building a life in a country that didn't always welcome black foreigners, but had given him a home anyway. They'd married in a small ceremony in Kyoto. They'd had a daughter they named Maya, who had Akiko's eyes and James's laugh and was being raised bilingual in an apartment in Tokyo's Setagaya ward. James had been teaching at Keio University as a tenured professor, giving lectures in Japanese about economic theory and development policy to students who sometimes forgot he wasn't Japanese himself because his command of the language erased the usual barriers. And then Akiko had been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer that killed her in 8 months despite every treatment they tried and every prayer James offered to gods he wasn't sure he believed in. Maya had been 4 when her mother died, old enough to understand that Mama wasn't coming back, but young enough to not fully grasp the permanence of forever. James had taken a leave from teaching to focus on his grieving daughter, had moved back to the United States temporarily to be near his family in Chicago, while he figured out how to be a single father in a country that felt foreign after 7 years away. This trip to Japan was supposed to be healing. James's department head at Keio had called offering him a temporary consulting position, helping restructure the economics curriculum, a low-pressure role that would let him ease back into work while staying connected to the university community that felt like home. James had thought maybe returning to Tokyo would help Maya remember her mother in the places Akiko had loved. Maybe walking the streets where Akiko had bought groceries and sitting in the parks where she'd pushed Maya on swings would make the grief feel less like drowning and more like remembering. They'd flown from Chicago to New York for a connecting flight to Tokyo. Maya had been doing okay until they'd reached the gate, and she'd seen a little girl around her age being held by her mother, and the sight had triggered a meltdown of tears and questions about why her mama couldn't hold her anymore. James had been soothing her as best he could, aware of the stares from other travelers, but too exhausted from grief and single parenting to care what strangers thought. Then Yuki Tanaka had started speaking in Japanese, her words clear and cutting even across the waiting area. James had understood every syllable, had heard himself reduced to a stereotype, had heard his daughter's grief dismissed as poor discipline, had felt the particular rage that comes from being dehumanized by someone who thought their wealth and language created a shield against accountability. So when he'd stood with Maya calm in his arms, he'd made a choice to respond in the language Yuki thought gave her safe distance from consequences. The terminal had gone quiet in the wake of James's response. Other Japanese travelers who'd overheard Yuki's initial comments now looked at her with expressions ranging from discomfort to disapproval. Kenji, her assistant, had taken 2 steps backward as if distance might protect him from the fallout. Yuki's face had gone through several colors, settling on a pale shade that suggested she was calculating how badly she just miscalculated. James continued in Japanese, his voice still controlled, but carrying an edge that made clear he was choosing restraint over the response she deserved. I am Dr. James Carter. I have a PhD from Waseda University where I studied for 7 years. I teach economic history at Keio University. I have published 3 books in Japanese. My late wife was Japanese. My daughter is half Japanese and bilingual. We are traveling to Tokyo because I have been offered a consulting position restructuring the economics curriculum at my university. So your assumptions about my education, my employment, my character, and my fitness as a parent are all incorrect. But please continue telling me about declining standards while you insult grieving children in public spaces. Several Japanese travelers nodded in agreement. An elderly woman approached James and spoke softly in Japanese, apologizing on behalf of Yuki's rudeness and offering Maya a wrapped candy from her purse. Maya accepted shyly, her tears finally stopping. Yuki had found her voice, though it had lost its earlier confidence. She responded in English, perhaps hoping to regain some control of the situation. I apologize if I offended you. It was not my intention to. James switched to English, his American accent now clear. It was absolutely your intention to offend me. You just didn't intend for me to understand you. There's a difference. You felt safe being cruel in Japanese because you assumed a black man couldn't possibly speak your language well enough to catch your insults. That assumption says everything about your character and nothing about mine. He shifted Maya's weight in his arms, her head now resting on his shoulder, exhausted from crying. I don't need your apology. What I need is for you to examine why you felt entitled to judge a stranger and his grieving child based on nothing except what we look like. What I need is for you to consider that maybe the people you dismiss without thought have stories and depths you can't imagine because you've never bothered to look past your own prejudices. Yuki opened her mouth, but no words came out. Kenji was now actively avoiding eye contact with everyone. The boarding announcement for their flight to Tokyo began, giving Yuki an excuse to escape the confrontation. She grabbed her designer carry-on and walked toward the gate with the rigid posture of someone pretending they weren't fleeing. James boarded the same flight with Amaya, who had fallen asleep against his chest. Their seats were in economy, while Yuki disappeared into first class. That physical separation maintaining the class divide even after the language barrier had collapsed. The 13-hour flight gave James plenty of time to think about the encounter and wonder if he'd handled it right. He could have let it go, could have ignored Yuki's comments and focused on comforting Maya. But something about being reduced to a stereotype in the language of his late wife's country, in front of his half-Japanese daughter, had felt like a violation too significant to let pass without response. He'd spent 7 years in Japan navigating the complicated experience of being black in a country that was overwhelmingly homogeneous, where curiosity about his presence was sometimes friendly and sometimes hostile, but always constant. Akiko had helped him understand the nuances, had run interference when her relatives questioned her choice to marry a black American, had taught him which battles to fight and which to let go. Without her, James felt less certain about his place in Japan, about whether Maya would be accepted as Japanese or always seen as foreign because of the half of her that came from him. The plane landed at Haneda at 4 p.m. Tokyo time. James cleared customs and immigration with Maya, who had woken up excited to be back in the city she considered home despite having been born in Chicago. They took a taxi to the university housing that Ko had arranged, a modest apartment near campus that was smaller than what they had had before, but felt manageable for a temporary stay. James's colleague, Professor Hayashi, came by that evening to welcome them back and discuss the consulting project. Hayashi was in his 60s, had been James's doctoral advisor, and had become a friend who'd helped navigate the bureaucracy of James's initial teaching appointment. Carter-san, it's good to see you, Hayashi said in Japanese, bowing slightly before pulling James into an unexpected hug. We've missed you, and Maya-chan has grown so much. He gave Maya a small toy that made her smile. Over tea, Hayashi explained the consulting work. The university wants to internationalize the economics curriculum. They want someone who understands both Japanese and Western economic frameworks and can bridge the two. You're the perfect candidate. The position is part-time, flexible, should give you time with Maya while keeping you engaged with academic work. James accepted gratefully. The work would be good for him, would give structure to days that had felt aimless since Akiko's death. Hayashi then mentioned something that made James's stomach drop. Also, I should mention that Tanaka Global Industries has become one of our major donors. Yuki Tanaka herself is on the university's board of trustees now. She's been pushing for more business-oriented curriculum changes. You'll likely encounter her at some point during your consulting work. James thought about the woman who'd insulted him at the airport, who was now apparently in a position of influence at the institution where he'd be working. I've already encountered her, he said, and proceeded to tell Hayashi about the airport terminal confrontation. Hayashi's expression shifted from concern to something approaching satisfaction. Tanaka-san has been difficult. She treats the university like another business acquisition. She's been pushing to eliminate programs she considers unprofitable, including some humanities departments. The administration tolerates her because her donations are substantial, but many faculty members find her approach troubling. He sipped his tea. The fact that you stood up to her is good. She's not accustomed to being challenged. But be careful. She has significant power and she's not known for forgiveness. James filed that warning away and focused on settling into Tokyo life. Maya started at a local international kindergarten where she'd be around other bilingual children. James began his consulting work, meeting with faculty to discuss curriculum revision. And he tried not to think about Yuki Tanaka, who surely had forgotten about their airport encounter and moved on to more important concerns. He was wrong. Yuki had not forgotten. In fact, she'd spent the flight to Tokyo replaying the confrontation and feeling something unfamiliar. Shame. She'd been wrong about James in every assumption. She'd insulted a grieving child and her father based on nothing except appearance. And she'd been called out in a way that made her realize how casually cruel she'd become, how much her wealth had insulated her from seeing people as actual humans, rather than categories to be judged. Yuki prided herself on intelligence and competence, and being so thoroughly wrong about someone bothered her more than she wanted to admit. When she learned through university channels that Dr. James Carter was the consultant hired to work on curriculum development, that he'd be presenting his preliminary recommendations at the next Board of Trustees meeting, where she'd be in attendance, Yuki felt the universe was forcing a reckoning she hadn't sought. The board meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks after James's arrival. He prepared his presentation carefully, knowing he'd be speaking to an audience that included Yuki, but refusing to let that affect his professionalism. His recommendations focused on creating more interdisciplinary approaches, bringing in perspectives from different economic systems, and ensuring students understood global markets from multiple cultural viewpoints rather than just Western frameworks. The presentation was thorough, well-researched, and delivered in flawless Japanese that impressed the board members who hadn't met James before. Yuki sat at the end of the conference table, her face carefully neutral, taking notes on an iPad. When James finished, several board members had questions about implementation and costs. James answered each with the kind of expertise that came from years of teaching and research. Then Yuki spoke, her first direct words to James since the airport. "Dr. Carter, your recommendations are interesting, but seem expensive to implement. How do you justify the cost of these changes when the university is facing budget constraints?" James met her eyes across the table. "The same way you justify research and development costs at Tanaka Global Industries. Investment in quality education pays long-term dividends even if the immediate costs seem high. Students who receive interdisciplinary, globally informed education become better thinkers and more valuable employees. Companies like yours benefit from that investment, even if you're not the one paying for it up front." There was a murmur of approval from other board members. Yuki's expression flickered with something that might have been respect. "Fair point. I'd like to discuss the implementation timeline with you separately. I have some thoughts about potential corporate partnerships that could offset costs." After the meeting ended, Yuki approached James as he was packing his materials. "Dr. Carter, do you have time for coffee? I'd like to discuss the partnerships and I'd like to apologize properly for what happened at the airport." James considered declining, but professional courtesy and curiosity won out. "There's a cafe near campus, 20 minutes. They walked in silence to a small coffee shop frequented by university faculty, the kind of place that had mismatched chairs and served exceptional pour-over coffee. Once seated, Yuki dispensed with small talk. "I was wrong at the airport. About you, about your daughter, about everything I assumed based on how you looked. I was cruel and I'm sorry." Her Japanese was formal, the language of someone genuinely trying to convey remorse. James sipped his coffee. "I appreciate the apology, but I need you to understand that what you did wasn't just rude to me personally. It was a reflection of prejudices that affect millions of people who don't have my education or language skills to defend themselves. You felt comfortable being cruel in Japanese because you assumed I was beneath you. That assumption was rooted in racism, whether you recognize it or not." Yuki didn't flinch from the accusation. "You're right. I've spent my life in bubbles of wealth and privilege that let me categorize people as worthy my biases because I've surrounded myself with people who either share them or won't challenge them. You challenge them, and I've been uncomfortable ever since." She paused. "I looked up your work after the board meeting was scheduled. Your books are impressive. Your research is the kind of rigorous scholarship my company actually relies on when we make decisions about entering Japanese markets. I benefited from your expertise without knowing it, while simultaneously thinking you weren't worth basic respect. That hypocrisy has been bothering me. James studied this woman who'd insulted his daughter and was now offering what seemed like genuine self-reflection. Why does it bother you? People like you usually just move on and forget about the people they've wronged. You have enough money and power that my opinion of you is irrelevant to your life. Yuki's answer was quiet. Because my father built our company on principles of respect and innovation. He used to say that true wealth came from lifting people up, not standing on top of them. After he died, I convinced myself that his approach was too soft, that ruthlessness was necessary for success. I've been successful by most measures, but I've also become someone he wouldn't recognize. Someone who insults grieving children in airports. She met James's eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness or friendship. I'm asking for help understanding how I became this person and how to be better. James leaned back in his chair, processing this unexpected request. You're asking the man you insulted to help you with your character development? That's an unusual request. It's a selfish one, Yuki admitted, but you're the first person who's told me hard truths and not been afraid of consequences. Everyone else in my life either fears me or wants something from me. You clearly don't need my approval or money. That makes you valuable. James thought about Akiko, who'd always believed in the possibility of people changing if they were willing to do uncomfortable work. I'm not a therapist or a character coach, but I'll tell you what I tell my students. Real change requires examining uncomfortable truths about yourself and then making different choices when the same situations arise. You felt comfortable being cruel at the airport because you've spent 40 years in environments that rewarded or ignored that cruelty. If you want to be different, you need to actively choose differently, even when it's inconvenient. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Yuki started showing up to curriculum development meetings, not as a board member throwing weight around, but as someone genuinely trying to learn. She asked questions about educational philosophy. She listened to faculty concerns about budget cuts and actually reconsidered some of her previous positions. She funded scholarships for underprivileged students instead of just donating to programs that would get her name on buildings. And she stopped insulting people in Japanese, having learned that assuming linguistic safety was both wrong and morally bankrupt. James didn't become her friend exactly, but he became something like a conscience she'd been missing. When she was considering a business decision that would profit her company at significant human cost, she'd call him and talk through the implications. When she caught herself making snap judgments about people, she'd pause and ask whether those judgments were based on evidence or prejudice. The change wasn't perfect or complete. Yuki still had instincts shaped by 40 years of privilege. But she was trying, and trying mattered. James's consulting work turned into a full-time teaching position when Keio offered him a permanent role developing and directing the new interdisciplinary economics program. Maya thrived in Tokyo, her grief over her mother's death slowly transforming from acute pain into bittersweet remembering. She'd visit Akiko's favorite places with James and tell her mom about her day, keeping that connection alive even as she built new memories. James found that teaching again gave him purpose beyond just surviving grief. His students were brilliant and curious, the kind of minds that made academic work feel meaningful. 2 years after the airport terminal confrontation, Yuki attended a lecture James gave about economic inequality and the moral responsibilities of corporations. The lecture hall was packed with students and faculty. James spoke passionately about how wealth concentration created social instability and how companies had obligations beyond shareholder value. He didn't mention Yuki by name, but several examples clearly referenced Tanaka Global Industries' past practices. After the lecture, Yuki approached him. That was devastating and accurate. I'm planning to present some policy changes to my board based on what you outlined. Will you consult on making them actually work? James raised an eyebrow. You want me to help you restructure your company to be less profitable but more ethical?